Hello, I'm Will. Welcome to ResearchPod. The idea of well-being can mean many different things, covering elements of mental, emotional, physical, social, and societal functions. Whatever your definition, it's worth looking after. So, how can you do that exactly? In today's episode, we hear from Dr Dianne Wepa, Associate Professor at Charles Darwin University in Australia, and Professor Haaken Strand of the Charles Darwin University Faculty of Health. They discuss what is meant by well-being in different cultures and when facing different challenges, be they personal, professional, or global. And joining me to discuss their work, Dr Dianne Wepa and Professor Haaken Strand. Good morning to the both of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
For a little bit of background to the listeners, and for my own self as well, if you could start us off by talking about some of the definitions of terms. What we're going to be talking about today is well-being, which a lot of people may have heard about in general pop psychology senses. What are the bounds of well-being in a research sense in terms of today's discussion?
Well-being has multiple definitions. There's not one uniform well-being over the whole world, so to say. World Health Organization has come up with one definition, which then has moved around a little bit between different countries. Even UK and Australia has different definitions. So well-being for you may not be well-being for me in Australia, which is kind of interesting in itself. But it normally states about the well-being, the main components that's quite generic and comes through in different countries, is the physical, the mental, the emotional, the social health, and quite often also involves the occupational. That's the main aim of well-being. So the definition is diverse between different countries, and also some countries includes environment, workplace, and there's a lot of aspects. But the physical and mental and emotional and social goes through in all definitions. So I think that's the really main thing. And they also quite closely connect to quality of life. You can say well-being and quality of life goes hand in hand a little bit. There's one definition called happy and prosperous. That come back to quality of life as well. But that's pretty much where it sits today in the well-being. And as I said, there's not one unifying definition, unfortunately, or interesting.
I absolutely agree. And in some countries, say like New Zealand, where I originate from, cultural and spiritual well-being has been added to the World Health Organization definition. So it does vary, I agree.
Well, then that raises the question of, in terms of the research that you guys are doing, how do you capture that data if we want to say that people are improving well-being or measuring well-being in certain circumstances against another, with the nebulous definitions and constraints placed upon it? Is it all just a matter of qualitative coding and qualitative research and then coding that into numerical data? Or what's your kind of general methodology for this big, weird, fuzzy area?
It's very common in my own case, for example, use mixed method. We use both quantitative and qualitative. You can, for example, have the quantitative part can be one of the quality of life tools. There's not so many tools developed yet for measuring of well-being quantitatively. So you can use that as quality of life because physical and mental comes out of two domains from quality of life that and relates to well-being. So if you do the quantitative quality of life and then you interview in focus or individual or something to get qualitative data about people experience as well-being, that can differ again. You can still have thematic analysis then in the different components of well-being later on.
And for areas around well-being, when that well-being starts veering out of being well, how do you then come up with definitions of different states of being unwell or resilience to challenges?
Again, that comes very much into the specific person or individual. Some people can have low physical mental health, but still have good well-being because they have lived with the chronic disease for a long time, for example, and adapt to that kind of life. But I think, poor person have this disease must be terrible. But if you have lived with that for 10, 15 years, you have most likely adapt your life to that life situation, and you feel happy and prosperous in that situation because you have adapted your whole lifestyle around it, and therefore you still have well-being referred to some definitions. The well-being is a difficult term to box in and measure because of that, because it's so individual how we experience well-being and what we put into the word of well-being. And as Dianne mentioned, the cultural aspect is very big as well.
I agree. And if you look at the seminal work of Kubler-Ross around stages of dying and dealing with grief, she even talks about having a good death. And so you could be dying, but still feel a level of well-being. So sometimes we think about well-being, is it freedom towards well-being or freedom from pain? And so unpacking even that, it's not just a state of homeostasis, is it? There's just so many variables, so different authors have a different take on it in terms of ages and stages.
I started my research area from Bandura's theory of self-efficacy that then feeds into self-management that Lorig, Wagner, Bodenheimer have developed further models of self-management. And if you have self-management for someone with chronic disease, for chronic conditions, then that can increase their well-being. That was the correlation I referred to with quality of life and well-being. That in my research, I use quality of life and different model of cares, and then how patients, when I interviewed them, how they experience their well-being, and how if they were controlling the disease or the disease controlled them, for example, they come into the occupational part or the social emotional part of their well-being and quality of life. I find that a very interesting aspect of well-being as a healthcare professional, how we can support patients, persons, individuals to live with their disease and adapt their life to their disease or the condition.
Today we hear about resilience, don't we? And certain people are more resilient than others, especially with the pandemics that we've had. And I was looking at the older literature from Michael Rutter in 1991, and he wrote, especially in terms of children, the term, because social work's my background, there used to be a term called invulnerable children. And over time, the term got replaced with resilience. And I thought, isn't that interesting when we look at the discourse around, the words that define people's behaviors and experience? And so I thought, well, that would be interesting to discuss, because when we look at the notion of resilience, it tends to be around absolute resistance to damage, if you look at it in a purist way of looking at it. But in reality, no one has absolute resistance. Rather, it's more appropriate to consider susceptibility to stress as a graded phenomena. And I think when we look at it over time, even the history of the term resilience and the studies that have occurred as well, we need to look at there's no single answer to life's problems, and it really does depend on the context and the time that something has occurred to someone, because all the literature says, you have twin studies, and then, for example, and then one person will respond differently to another depending on their internal reactions as well. So psychology's done a lot of work in terms of resilience and exposure to risk. And so do we look at avoidance of an event, or especially in medicine in terms of infections and resilience in that pure medical way of looking at it? Or do we look at exposure over time to a pathogen? And so, in terms of social sciences, is it regular exposure to some sort of event or experience that perhaps develops resilience over time?
Well, I'd say that the last couple of years have been a big case study for the entire world with some of that chronic exposure, as you've mentioned, from the pandemics and stresses of modern life onwards. Not going to draw attention to any one event since 2020 because the events keep happening and we'd like this to be as untime bound a podcast as possible, but boy howdy, the events. So, in terms of the scale of those challenges, from the individual to the community, to society, to the globe, how can we see short-term challenges on those different levels of severity to an individual? Or, like I say, extrapolating out across many, many, many billions of individuals?
Become quite apparent, especially during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, when one of the dimensions of well-being is occupational and environmental. And because of the environment, you couldn't leave your house, for example, or you couldn't travel, you couldn't occupationally move around how you wanted. And people felt very locked up and closed in and boxed in, so to say, and they lost their freedom. And that reduced the well-being for a number of people and put a lot of psychological stress and mental and well as well because of that. So I think the occupational or movement, physical well-being as a result of the environment you live in is very important as well.
The protective influences may actually stem from early childhood experiences. And I think that, just reflecting on my own upbringing, because I'm a Generation X person, and we were known anecdotally to be left alone a lot to our own devices. And, if you hurt yourself, the parents didn't, I wouldn't say not care, but you were kind of built resilience over time because you had to, cope. And so I think there's something around our early childhood experiences being exposed to risk, which actually develops protective factors over time. And so linking back to chronic illness or disease, I think that resonates, doesn't it, that you're exposed to something over time. But that doesn't always mean it's a good thing, because say if you're in a low income area and that may be very dangerous and you have to move neighborhood to keep yourself and your family safe, it may be that you've developed resilience because you've moved, but it doesn't account for the societal factors of low income and cost of living crisis and those sorts of things. And so with the Christchurch earthquake and the shootings that occurred in my country in New Zealand, there was some study on resilience and how people responded. And there was what was called there was a university student that got the student army rallied to help people with the earthquakes in particular. However, when you go to other countries where perhaps there isn't that strong sense of community, the response is not as effective or instant, and people look to government or outside countries to provide assistance.
I think we have seen it in other kind of nature catastrophe situation in Australia as well, with we quite often have floods here, floods or big forest fires, and how people just get together and help each other and support each other. I lived through the flood in Brisbane in 2011, and suddenly you have all these volunteers coming in and help to clean up the streets and remove garbage and stuff for us. And that impact the environment you're living in, and you feel that support, the spiritual inspiration from other people, and that psychological support is very important for the well-being in that situation.
And so is the question then comes up in terms of research, like, is there a trade-off between resilience and well-being? Can you be poor and unwell, but resilient? And so, there's sort of an interesting research question as well, the connection between the trade-off.
What I think should be really, really terrible life situation, for example, someone who lives in that environment all the time, they have war going on, they have no money, very little food, but after 3 months, 3 years, they get used to live with that. So they learn how to adapt with resilience to that life situation, and still maybe are positive, maybe not so prosperous, but they can be positive and still have, they experience good well-being.
And there's a study that was done in Japan on patients with type 1 diabetes. And the researchers there created what was called functional perpetual resilience. And that emerged as a concept where patients progress through the 5 stages of developing resilience to face adversity. So it's interesting when you do look at perhaps quite cohesive societies like Japan, where the type 1 diabetes is interpreted to be something that you have to function through. Would you have any comments on that, Haaken, coming from your background?
I haven't looked so much on that continent. I know 10, 20 years ago, they didn't hardly had any diabetes in Japan. And then they started getting more Western food and Western lifestyle, and the diabetes came along. But those things, they are very much that you're not supposed to bother anyone else. You have to just live with your situation and be happy with that. It's their culture, kind of a spiritual environment they're living in. But that's the only comment I have in that specific area.
Well, you mentioned there that someone in a natural disaster or war, that after 3-6 months they will have a kind of a live with it approach, a management. Does that then affect the ongoing psychological well-being in terms of what we might call today post-traumatic stress disorder?
I will argue that they have an ongoing unwellness, but quite often with PTSD, we quite often don't see it until they change the environment and go back to normal social life, if you call it that, if from a war zone, an armed defense force or something like that. When they go back to the civil life, then the PTSD hit them because the environment is not there. The support around them has changed. So therefore the PTSD come up to the surface and hit them, and quite often hit the emotional more than the physical side of them. But I think the environment has a big impact. Environments such as the social support around them, so not the geographic environment, more the social environment they're living in, the support with people with the same experience. They have something in common that put them together, and they belong somewhere and they can support each other, and therefore increase the well-being while they are in that social situation.
And that leads nicely to what are the protective factors that seem to support some people to respond differently. And quite an old study, Jenkins and Smith, 1990, they found that children were protected by a good relationship with one parent when the family as a whole was characterized by overall discord. And so they looked at quite dysfunctional families where there may have been alcohol, drugs, or disharmony. And so we know, even anecdotal, if you have one adult, even if it's not the parent, maybe it's a teacher or someone that you can connect with, there's more of a likelihood that increases your protective factors in terms of your response. Yeah. So it's a lot of it comes back to your early age, isn't it? The formative years and how you were exposed to certain conditions.
Well, that leads on to the concept of resilience and resistance having I think it's quite modern framing, but it might be there's an old way of thinking about it that I'm unaware of. To borrow from a book about economics, the phrase of anti-fragile, that rather than resisting stressor or resisting a challenge and continuing with the system or state that you were in before, that there is a healing and an evolution that can be strengthened by challenges to enhance and develop a stronger system so that future challenges are met without kind of just wearing away at the same stock of resistance, but to be stronger and more adept and more adept at dealing with it. Is there anything like that in terms of wellness and well-being and psychological development?
Sometimes we just focus too much on one event or what's happened then rather than perhaps the lifespan approach of, say, an individual and the processes that they went through to respond early in life and then in the future as well. So it does become a little bit more complex than one thing, and that's just from a psychological view. Yeah, it's looking at the literature where it says protection does not reside in the psychological chemistry of the moment. So I'm reading this, but rather in the ways in which people deal with life changes and what they do about their stressful or disadvantaging circumstances. So, in that connection, particular attention needs to be paid to the mechanisms underlying developmental processes that enhance people's ability to cope effectively with future stress and adversity, like you say, and those that enable people to overcome the past psychosocial hazards. So we have an appreciation of indicators of risk and protective factors, and we have little understanding of the processes they seem to reflect, but substantially less knowledge about how to influence those processes in order to increase resilience. And that also goes into the research I'm doing with the midwifery students. So I'm working with a PhD student at the University of South Australia, and we have a research team. And she's a midwife, and she felt that when she was a midwifery student, there was a lot of bullying that occurred towards midwifery students by the midwives. And she thought, well, I need to have a look at that. And so she's doing her research now, and she's saying globally that's actually something that happens a lot in midwifery in terms of bullying and violence. And students are most vulnerable, as you would expect, because they are students, they have less power. And what then happens is the students perpetuate the cycle of violence to quote unquote fit in when they do secure their jobs. And so we've done what's called an integrative review. It's a type of literature review where we looked at comparing different universities, and it highlighted the importance of actually including a component in their undergraduate degree on bullying, like the realities of the workplace. And that could be controversial as well, because you might say, well, you need to leave that to the workplace. That's not the university's role on dealing with the nuances of the workplace, and not every workplace involves bullying. So that's where we're at the moment with that PhD project with her, is to really name it and lean in towards the evidence that is saying this is a problem in the midwifery profession. I'm not sure, Haaken, if you want to comment on that for nursing.
Unfortunately, we have definitely the same problem in nursing on an international level. It doesn't matter from country to country, and it's called horizontal bullying or horizontal violence, where the more senior nurse always try to put down the more junior one. Because I had a rough time, you must have a rough time, and we have seen it over decades. It's not a new phenomena. It's new because we now start to look into it and admit that it's there. and it's terrible. It's there because it shouldn't be. We should be able to be supporting each other and work together as one profession, so to say, but we still have this struggle within the profession. So it's common in the nursing side as well on the international level.
What you mentioned there, the phrase of "I had a rough time, so you had a rough time," that seems to be kind of the psychology at the core of power struggle, power dynamics, and self-assertion that as a new parent, I have heard a lot from previous generation advocated for that perpetuity of violence. This is just how it is. So do you see that transferring outside of the professional world, either in literature or in any other academic experience, that there is just, however I had it, you must have it at least as bad, rather than trying to make it better or at least as good?
And I think, as we mentioned, the whole power struggle. If I have worked hard to get to this level, you have to earn your stripes as well. You don't get them for free. Yes, to go to university, you get the stripes. You have to earn your stripes as well. So you have to kind of prove yourself for people in the workplace, unfortunately. And there's not, unfortunately, not too much research into it. There is some research, but there's not too much because it's such a sensitive area. So people doesn't really want to partake in it. And it's also difficult to get ethics approval to look into violence. It's not that easy either sometimes. And then recruit participants is very difficult.
And the study I'm doing with the midwifery students, I agree. We had to go to 2 ethics committees to 2 different universities with 2 degrees in midwifery. And so it wasn't easy. Yeah, there was a lot of ethical concerns that maybe it would traumatize students to talk about the bullying, and you had to ensure, yeah, they had counseling support services. Yeah, so there's a lot. And I think the good thing I like about this research is, it's like I said, it's naming it. It's saying it's happening, and rather than, the custom and tradition of suck it up, that's just life, and trying to provide a solution in terms of their degree. So have something in there. And I think in terms of like education in general, say at a high school level, I think the real world type of learning probably could permeate right through the education system around these real world ways that we need to communicate better with each other. Yeah. And I think bullying was probably always there, but now we have technology. You can bully someone online easy, a keyboard warriors, that kind of thing. So maybe it could be, we could say every generation has said that's there, but the instances are counted more perhaps now that we have technology to say it's happening.
You are both colleagues working in Australian universities and across New Zealand as well. But I think it is interesting to talk about different cultural responses. You've mentioned Japan and the Australian response to fires and floods. So I wonder if I could ask you both to maybe reflect on how there is any cultural difference in how you, as people, not just as researchers, but as members of those communities in Australia, in New Zealand, in global research, feel about how your cultural background informs your research and involves your participation in your community, in your local environment.
The cultural lens is coming through more and more now and challenging the traditional sort of Western definitions of a lot of these concepts that are to do with human beings and experience. And I think the focus culturally for me anyway tends to be on, the literature seems to be on being able to cope with and overcome difficulties and become strengthened by these difficulties. That seems to be the overall agreement in the literature. And there seems to be a lack of focus around the protective factors that, like I said, from early childhood, what is it that makes that person more resilient than another? And internationally, there's a concept called we identity. So you have identity, and a lot of traditional cultures focus on we identity. So I've written a lot on that, and people go, oh, that's an interesting term. And it's basically the collective orientation of a lot of traditional cultures where in the language you may say, so tell me about your experiences with the earthquakes. And someone from a kinship based culture pretty much automatically says, oh, we did this and we did that. So that tells you straight away their collective orientation and their way of being and doing. They may not say I. And so from that collective form of identity, if you like, you can actually see there's nuances, there's signposts to say, oh, okay, coming together as a cultural group is the norm perhaps for that person. And so those sorts of cultures, there's probably more of a cultural response and a collective response to adversity, as opposed to, say, other cultures that it's very much the individual. So I think there's something in that space that we could look at more in terms of response and resilience as a concept, in terms of collective cultures response. Like the Japanese one, that's a good example, which is a very homogenous culture, and they would lean towards the collective, as we know, with business and everything else that that's done, in that culture. So I think there's a lesson to be learnt there.
As a researcher, changing from one culture or one continent to another continent, the only thing I can think about straight up is you come from one culture or one country with certain values, and to another, come from Sweden to Australia, a lot of similarities, but some things really hit me. The much stronger segregation in Australia, for example, and that can affect then how you see this well-being among people from different groups, and also the inequity between male and female. While in Sweden it was pretty much more equitable than here. Australia is still quite a bit difference between male and female. So that's affecting us when you're going to do like quality of life research and well-being and interview patients or people. You may not always have the same background values with you, and you have to be aware of that when you start to do analysis. That can impact how you interpret the information you have received in an interview, for example.
Just to sign off, I really like the 5 ways to well-being, which the research I've done on that is from the UK, which I'm quite pleased about, because when I was in New Zealand, I would hear those 5 ways to well-being, and then when I moved to the UK, I heard them again. And then one of my colleagues, Professor Mary Steen, she said, they originated from the UK. So, well, just I need to acknowledge where that's come from. And if you don't recall what they are, it's to connect, keep learning, be active, give, and take notice. And I think that resonates no matter what culture you come from or place you originate from. It's always a good sort of framework, I think, to just have us take a pause, because I think, working from Kristen Neff, she's a great advocate of taking a pause in one's life. But that's for another podcast for another day. So I think, yeah, if we take a pause and just look at the 5 ways to well-being: connect, keep learning, be active, give, and take notice. I mean, that is evidence-based as well, those 5 ways. And so I think it works. So why wouldn't we do that?
If there's anyone who's heard this interview and says, oh, I want to know more about resilience or more about differences or more about any part, what would be a good DOI to send them to, or a good journal title? This is just a chance where we're going to put all of the links in the episode description for, read more, even if it's just head to my staff page and click any of the papers there.
I did publish a paper in 2019 called Struggling to Be Involved. And that was a theory that I created out of my PhD to look at, for Indigenous people anyway, in New Zealand, how they were able to draw on their collective sense of well-being in order to navigate through the healthcare system in New Zealand. And, there were elements of racism, historical trauma, things like that. But there were a lot of positives that came out of that, and being resilient was one of them. So if listeners are interested in looking at a cultural response to resilience, they can definitely look at that journal article.
And Haaken, anything on your side that you'd like to plug or promote at this point?
Not directly. The last papers I've had has been much more about clinical research, so it doesn't really affect the well-being or impact on the well-being, unfortunately. I shouldn't have thought about it. It's not in that area.
But if people want to look at historical literature, because that's why I was bringing up Michael Rutter, 1991, like, it's interesting, isn't it, when you look back at research that's 20, 30 years old and you think it still resonates today. So I'd be interested on what the listeners think, looking at the older foundational type literature on resilience, and see whether there has been a change.
And even go back to the 70s and Bandura's self-efficacy theory. Because if you can look after yourself, then it should cover the 5 areas of well-being and give you well-being as well.
So we can provide those references as well, if people like.
How would you try and condense attitudes and research and your own activity down to a couple of sentences
I think we can take a leaf out of the pandemic and the human response to infections and chronic disease, as Hawkins says. And I think, yeah, the takeaway would be that instead of looking at a single event and thinking how we respond to avoid an event or an occasion to become resilience. I think looking at a controlled exposure over time and like childhood experiences and how over time that has brought us to a point of becoming resilience, because I think it's something that the process takes time for us as humans to arrive at that point. It can't just be one thing, and how it's easy for us to judge, say, oh, you're not resilient because. So I think that's not useful. So in terms of research, I think looking back in terms of someone's childhood experience, like we said before, if there's one adult that role models a good response to traumatic events, for example, then that role modeling will come through to our early childhood experiences. So I think it's over time, it's a lifetime of exposure to situations that I think help build our resilience rather than avoiding a situation to become resilient.
Spin further on that, I would say that you mentioned having this role model person, they may represent some kind of emotional safety feeling for you, and therefore you can build from that and develop kind of resilience that then underpin your well-being, because you kind of learn, you don't feel threatened all the time. You know that there's somewhere to safe point that you can find strength from. And as you said before, now and then take time out, sit down and really think, where am I? What do I really want to do? What is the best way for me? I think that's its important part, and go in and see how can we help people to build that, how can we empower them to have that take off time where they can look into themselves and see their way forward.
Building protective factors, isn't it? Yeah. And grounding ourselves too. There's literature on that now, like taking a pause, grounding ourselves, and then it builds resilience over time.
Dr. Wepa, Professor Strand, thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you.